Every family has its locked doors, its hidden arguments, and its quiet estrangements. But most families don't have three completely isolated people. A father, a mother, and a sister, all telling the exact same chilling story without ever whispering a word to each other. There is no group chat. There is no shared agenda. There is no synchronized public relations strategy behind their claims. Yet when you listen to what they are all independently describing, it completely shatters the carefully curated image of a woman the world thinks it knows. We are looking at a narrative of deep compassion broadcast to millions, completely contradicted by the cold, transactional reality experienced by the people who knew her before the fame. And trust me, once you see the pattern hiding in plain sight, you will never look at this story the same way again. Before the global fame, the magazine covers, and the massive streaming deals, there was just a father. We are not talking about a distant parent who dropped in occasionally and demanded credit later. We are talking about a regular man who poured everything he had, every dollar, every connection, and every ounce of his energy into giving his daughter a real shot at the life she so desperately wanted. Thomas made incredibly painful sacrifices, handing over his own resources and quietly stepping back so she could step forward. For a long time, that was simply the arrangement. You give, she grows, and one day the world knows her name. Most parents would call that the ultimate victory. Thomas did all of that, and the world finally did learn her name. But that is exactly when the fabric of their family started to unravel entirely. Because here is the reality that rarely makes it into the glossy documentaries. After the wedding, the absolute pinnacle of her life, a moment Thomas had essentially been building toward through decades of quiet sacrifice, reaching his own daughter, became structurally impossible. We are not talking about the natural drift of a busy life. Trying to get a simple phone call required navigating a labyrinth of assistants, intermediaries, and PR representatives. Imagine raising a child from nothing, only to find yourself forced to submit a formal request to strangers just to hear her voice. And what did he get back most of the time? An absolute hollow void. Not a messy argument that would at least imply a real emotional connection, but total silence. That kind of silence is its own brutal message. But that was only the beginning of a much deeper freeze. While Thomas was privately trying to claw his way back into his daughter's life through a tangle of corporate gatekeepers, she was standing in front of cameras delivering flawless speeches about gratitude, family bonds, and the deep meaning of connection. The audiences devoured it because it sounded profoundly real. It sounded like the words of a grounded, deeply empathetic person. But according to Thomas, every public display of family values was an immaculate performance. The connection the public was weeping over wasn't a reflection of what was happening behind closed doors. It was an illusion so polished that the gap between the public brand and the private reality was nearly impossible to detect. So, how did a devoted father get pushed entirely out of the frame? The story takes a dark turn that many have either forgotten or misunderstood. Long before the royal wedding, Thomas became the story not because he was chasing the spotlight, but because the global press had ruthlessly decided he was their next target. You have to understand the psychology of this moment. You are a private citizen who has lived entirely out of the public eye. Suddenly, you are stalked at the grocery store, cornered at the coffee shop, and hunted outside your front door. And the people surrounding your daughter, the ones with endless resources, elite security, and crisis management teams, offered him absolutely nothing. No guidance, no protection, not a single word of advice. So, when external forces came to Thomas with a plan to regain some control over his fractured image, he listened. Security footage emerged, showing him coordinating with a photographer on a series of staged shots, reading books about Britain getting fitted for a suit. On the surface, they were innocent snapshots of a proud father getting ready for the big day. But because they were set up the moment the truth surfaced, the narrative shifted violently. The man who had been overwhelmed and abandoned by the system was instantly rebranded as a liability. This misstep, born out of desperation and terrible advice, handed the people around his daughter the exact ammunition they needed. It gave them the perfect airtight justification to lock the gates on him completely. And what happened next would shock everyone. The stress of the global media circus combined with the devastating isolation from his daughter finally took its toll. Right before the wedding, Thomas suffered a massive cardiac event. His body simply gave out. It made it physically impossible for him to get on a plane and attend the one day that mattered more than any other. As he lay in a hospital bed navigating a terrifying medical emergency, what came from his daughter's side? Deafening silence. No desperate calls flooding the ward. No quiet personal messages finding their way through the nurse's station. The phone at his bedside stayed completely still. For a man already drowning in months of unanswered requests, that silence landed with devastating finality. It felt like a door being permanently bolted shut. Shortly after the wedding, the narrative took another highly orchestrated turn. A group of unnamed close friends gave an exclusive interview to a major magazine painting a picture of a heartbroken daughter who had written her father a deeply emotional letter begging him to stop talking to the press. It was a compelling, beautifully tragic story that framed her as the ultimate wounded party. But Thomas had the actual letter, and he felt the public was being sold a complete fiction. He took a massive risk and shared parts of it not to expose his child, but because staying silent felt like agreeing to a fabricated history. When people finally read the words, the illusion began to crack. The tone wasn't a raw, messy outpouring of emotion from a grieving daughter. It was incredibly precise. Every single line felt structured, deliberate, and engineered for maximum impact. Thomas came to a realization that utterly broke him. He wasn't reading a message meant for a father's eyes. He was reading a document drafted for a future audience. It later surfaced that her inner circle had cooperated with the authors of a major biography cooperation they had previously aggressively denied. Suddenly, the letter existed inside a pattern of meticulously shaped storytelling where even the most intimate family moments were weaponized for public relations. He wasn't corresponding with a daughter anymore. He was corresponding with a brand. But he wasn't the only one experiencing this bizarre transactional reality. If you only consumed the public moments, you would believe Doria Ragland had the most beautiful, effortless relationship with her daughter. She was the calm, composed anchor in a chaotic story, the one person who felt genuinely, authentically real. But what allegedly happened when the cameras were packed away hits entirely differently. According to whispers from those close to the situation, that radiant warmth did not translate into open access in private. Visits did not just naturally slow down due to busy schedules. They allegedly became formally scheduled events. We are talking about a mother who raised her child from birth, reportedly having to book time in advance through an army of intermediaries, as if requesting an audience with an executive. The moments Doria was requested to appear lined up almost flawlessly with moments that required a very specific image. Whenever a public-facing event demanded the optics of a warm, supportive family, she was there smiling, present flawless. But the second that PR requirement evaporated, she was allegedly sidelined right back out of the frame. Brought in for the optics, discarded when the usefulness ran out. When the explosive Netflix documentary dropped, people watched Doria closely. While she wasn't reading from a script, her delivery felt deeply rehearsed. Her phrasing, the specific buzzwords, and the pacing mirrored the highly polished corporate language her daughter used. It sparked intense rumors in Hollywood that her new role within her daughter's empire came with incredibly strict strings, attached managed talking points, controlled appearances, and a loyalty arrangement that was anything but natural. The silent, dignified mother suddenly had a voice, but only when that voice served the brand. That isn't a family dynamic. That is a carefully managed calendar. And then there is the sister who was there for it all. For most of her life, Samantha was the one who shared the awkward phases, the quiet days, and the reality that existed decades before the fame. But as the spotlight grew blinding, the foundation crumbled. It didn't happen in one explosive argument. It was a slow, agonizing freeze-out. Invitations slowed. Conversations felt filtered as if every word was being run through a risk assessment checklist. Eventually, Samantha wasn't speaking to her directly at all. She was forced to navigate the same go-betweens as Thomas. A deliberate, structured barrier was erected between two people who used to share a life. The fatal blow arrived during the infamous Oprah interview. Sitting across from one of the most powerful hosts on Earth, in front of tens of millions of viewers, a claim was made she essentially grew up as an only child. For Samantha watching from home, those words were a devastating erasure. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a conscious televised decision to rewrite the past so it fit a cleaner, more marketable origin story. A complicated sibling didn't fit the narrative of the solitary self-made heroine, so she was simply wiped from the official record. Samantha fought back, loudly arguing that a quiet campaign had been running for years to paint her as an unhinged opportunist, all to protect a heavily fabricated history. Take a step back and look at the terrifying symmetry of this situation. You have a father, a mother, and a sister. 3 completely different people, 3 totally different vantage points, 0 coordination. And yet they are all describing the exact same invisible cage. They all describe a relationship that stopped feeling human and started feeling like a transaction where terms were dictated entirely by one side. A father navigating assistance, a mother booking appointments, a sister erased on global television. You can dismiss one bitter relative. You might even be able to explain away 2. But when all 3 independently arrive at the exact same chilling conclusion without ever comparing notes, the math stops adding up. There are moments in life that are supposed to cut through the noise, the PR strategies and the grudges. Moments so raw and terrifying that they leave only one question. Are you going to show up? For Thomas Markle, that moment arrived when he suffered a severe medical crisis, a massive stroke that left him fighting to speak and move. It was global news. There was 0 possibility her team didn't know. If you had watched the years of managed access and silent phones, you might have hoped this would be the moment the brand faded and the human being stepped forward. No press releases, no cameras, just a private call, a quiet bouquet of flowers sent to the ward, 5 minutes of acknowledging a father fighting for his life. The phone never rang. The silence remained absolute. And that is why this story is impossible to shake. You can theorize about the pressures of fame or the need to set healthy boundaries. But when a father is incapacitated in a hospital bed and the decision is total silence that shatters the facade, that doesn't fit neatly into a narrative about protecting your peace. It exposes a chilling reality where compassion is a highly profitable brand value rather than an actual human practice. The story sold to the world was about walking away from a toxic institution to live authentically. But the people who share her blood aren't talking about authenticity. They are talking about being handled sidelined and erased. When the cameras finally stop rolling and there is no one left to perform for you, have to wonder who is actually left in the room. But the rabbit hole goes much deeper than a few ignored phone calls and formal appointments. Because isolating 3 separate family members with surgical precision isn't just a personal failing, it is a highly calculated corporate strategy. To truly understand how this level of alienation is achieved, you have to look at the machinery operating just out of frame. When an ordinary family experiences a rupture, there are slammed doors, heated arguments, and eventual apologies. But when a fully monetized billionaire-backed brand experiences a family rupture crisis, managers are deployed. The people who knew the original version of the subject aren't treated as relatives. They are treated as hostile liabilities. Imagine the psychological toll of realizing that your own flesh and blood has outsourced their relationship with you to a high-powered crisis management firm in Beverly Hills. Every text message you send isn't being read by your daughter. It's being analyzed by a team of publicists scanning for risks. Nowhere was this corporate strategy more obvious and more devastating than during the infamous sit-down with Oprah Winfrey. We already talked about how Samantha was wiped from the timeline, but the treatment of Thomas during that same broadcast was a masterclass in narrative redirection. Sitting in that lush, perfectly lit garden in front of a global audience, a deliberate parallel was drawn. She looked directly into the camera and effectively equated a desperate, unguided father making a terrible media misstep with an unforgivable, calculated act of ultimate betrayal. She spoke softly about looking at her own young child and being utterly unable to fathom causing them such pain. It was a brilliant, highly manipulative piece of television. It reframed Thomas not as an overwhelmed old man abandoned to the wolves of the tabloid press, but as a malicious mastermind who intentionally sabotaged his daughter's fairy tale. What that televised narrative conveniently omitted was the sheer terrifying imbalance of power. On one side, you had a woman backed by the most powerful media figures on the planet, armed with unlimited resources, royal protection officers, and elite advisors scripting her every move. On the other side, you had an 80-year-old man living in a quiet border town in Mexico, utterly defenseless against a global paparazzi swarm that had descended on his front lawn. He didn't have a war room of strategists, he had a landline and panic. Yet the story sold to the public flipped the script entirely, portraying the untouchable Duchess as the fragile victim and the isolated pensioner as the ruthless aggressor. It is a stunning deficit of empathy packaged and sold to millions as a brave masterclass in setting healthy boundaries. And here's the detail that truly makes the blood run cold. The exact same playbook used on Thomas, Doria, and Samantha wasn't retired after the royal wedding. It was simply exported. Because if you can ruthlessly sideline the father who bankrolled your dreams, if you can put the mother who raised you on a corporate calendar, and if you can erase the sister who shared your childhood, what chance did an ancient British institution have? The mechanics of the estrangement we witnessed with the Markle family were practically a dress rehearsal for the grandest freeze-out in modern history. The sudden, unbridgeable distance, the weaponization of private conversations, the reliance on unnamed close friends planting favorable narratives in magazines, the bombshell televised interviews designed to corner the other party into silence. We had seen it all before. The Windsor family suddenly found themselves dealing with the exact same impossible architecture that Thomas Markle had been banging his head against for years. The royal family is famously stoic, operating on the centuries-old mantra of never complain, never explain. But they were completely outmaneuvered by a sophisticated PR machine that had already perfected its tactics on a much smaller, much more vulnerable target. Suddenly, the royals were feeling what Thomas felt. The chilling realization that every private interaction was no longer a family discussion, but material being harvested for a future streaming documentary or a ghost-written memoir. The tragedy of Thomas Markle wasn't just a sad family dispute, it was the origin story of a strategy that would eventually shake the monarchy to its core. What happens to a person when they curate their life this aggressively? When compassion is merely a buzzword printed on a charitable foundation's letterhead, rather than an instinct deployed when your father suffers a stroke, you don't end up protecting your peace. You end up building an incredibly glamorous high-security prison. The circle of trust shrinks until it practically vanishes, leaving only employees' sycophants and people who are financially incentivized to tell you exactly what you want to hear. The authentic connections of the past are severed because they are too messy, too unpredictable, and too real to fit inside the sanitized, perfectly lit narrative of the brand. The ultimate cost of this meticulously crafted illusion is profound isolation. A performance, no matter how globally broadcast or heavily awarded, cannot keep you warm at night. The gap between the public rhetoric of universal healing and the private reality of discarded family members is a chasm that cannot be bridged by good public relations. The father lies in a hospital bed, staring at a silent phone. The sister screams into the void of the internet, desperately trying to prove she existed in her own family. The mother smiles flawlessly on red carpets, her access granted and revoked by the invisible hands of schedule makers. This isn't just a story about the trappings of fame, the toxic nature of the press, or the heavy crown of royalty. It is a terrifying case study in what happens when a human being decides to fully transition into a brand. It is a stark warning about the danger of treating the people who loved you first as expendable assets on a balance sheet. The velvet curtain is finally pulling back, the carefully placed studio lights are dimming, and the world is starting to notice that the stage is devastatingly empty. If this is the first time you're hearing this side of the story, drop a comment below and let us know what you think. And if you want to keep unlocking the hidden truths nobody else is telling here on Noble Secrets, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We'll see you in the next one.